Welcome to our second session of the summer semester. Today, our focus is on the immigrant narrative, and we have two speakers who are going to share their personal experiences of moving to the United States. So first, I'll introduce both of our speakers, and then we have a great set of questions that we're going to discuss in this experience. So first, I would like to introduce Iselina Gilzine, who is an assistant professor and program director at Goodwin University. She is a resident of East Hartford, and she oversees the Human Services Associate and Bachelor's Degree programs and coordinates internship practicums. Iselina works closely with community partners and the institution's career services to ensure students are provided with career opportunities upon graduation. Past experiences include serving as a clinical supervisor and clinician for the Village for Families and Children in Hartford. She currently serves on the board of directors for the Network Against Domestic Abuse, located in Enfield, and also volunteers at East Hartford High School. She received her bachelor's degree in sociology with a criminology focus from Eastern Connecticut State University and a master's degree in social work from the University of Connecticut. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And we also have Michelle Strader, who is a graduate of Geneseo College in New York and has almost 20 years of experience in the nonprofit and pre-K to 12 public education field. Michelle holds a master's in public administration with a nonprofit management concentration. With budgeting and fiscal management skills, she has successfully managed multi-million-dollar school budgets, maximizing resources to students and teachers. As a grant writer, she has written and been awarded grants ranging from thousands to multi-million-dollar awards from state, local, federal, and private foundation grantors. Lastly, she is a proud Guyanese American, having immigrated to the US in the late 80s. So thank you, Michelle and Iselina, for being here with us today. As I had mentioned to our audience, today we're going to have sort of a personal narrative conversation about your experiences. We have a few questions I will ask for our panel discussion. As always, I will just mention to the audience, please feel free if you have any questions or want to add. I'll be monitoring the chat, so I can certainly ask our speakers during our conversation, or at the end, we'll provide some time for discussion, okay? All right, so let's get started. So to first begin, can you tell us both a little bit about your story? Can you tell us about your story as an immigrant American? So whoever would like to start first.
Hi, everyone. So for me, I migrated to the United States July 2nd, 1989. And I will say that what first shaped my experience as an immigrant American was when I landed in JFK, I thought for sure that the streets were lined with gold. I sincerely, and I say this, I was sincerely disappointed because I was born and raised in Jamaica. And so, I grew up with one channel, right? And so on that one public broadcasting channel, what we see about America, it was just, wow, I want to go here. And so I was disappointed that I landed and the roads were like roads that I had back home. The people were different in many ways, yet similar. We're all human beings. Back home, I was familiar with more prejudices than I was racism. And so I'd never been in an environment where there were so many Caucasians. I had never been in an environment where I was served by people that didn't look like me. And so at 13 years old, it was quite a shock. But thankfully, I didn't stay in New York. We only landed in New York. I came right to Hartford, Connecticut, and moved to the North End. And that had a pretty good balance of West Indian culture and heritage. So it was a nice adjustment after a while. But it was, to say the least, daunting for a 13-year-old because I did not want to be here. And from time to time, I do have these moments of, I want to go home because I didn't want to be here. But as you all know, getting assimilated into a new environment, having a family, work, it's not so easy to change that per se. So for me, I didn't view it as a positive experience. I've grown to accept my new world and new ways of living as an immigrant American. My children are forced my children are forced into making sure they recognize their heritage. Now, one thing I will say in closing is what I've come to embrace fully is the educational opportunities. And so back home, if you don't get A pluses, not A minus, B plus, there's absolutely nothing for you. And so I unfortunately was not an A plus student. We would have students that graduate with, high GPAs and can't afford to go to college. So what I will say what shaped my experience here in America was the opportunity to get an education that I would not be afforded back home.
Hmm. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
So, hi, Michelle. Similar to Isolina's story, I came when I was 7 in probably like October of 1988. And I still did believe that America's roads were paved in gold because I landed in JFK as well at night. And I don't know what was on the asphalt or whatever, but it had sparkles. So I was fascinated by the sparkles and I was like, oh, really? So maybe it is still, maybe it's not gold, but it's diamonds or something because the road was sparkly. I do remember it was cold. So my dad brought me a jacket. And it was pink. Getting adjusted for me was different. Like I always say, I didn't know I was Black until I came to America, and had to kind of learn the history of Black Americans and really then understand that same history was, by virtue of my skin color, was then placed upon me. So I had to learn it. But, at first, that was like much later on in like my college years, but being 7 and starting in the 2nd grade here was an interesting experience just of adjusting for the first time, seeing different folks. It was just a learning experience in of itself. And then luckily, the neighborhood that we moved in, my dad was set up in the Bronx. So I moved into a pretty diverse neighborhood in the Bronx that later became less diverse. But it was still an adjustment, being from Guyana and coming to America and navigating the education system here. Because I think right off the bat, I was automatically put into, I guess, what we would call remedial classes to start with. Like I distinctly remember my mom having to have my classes changed 3 times because then the work that they were doing in the other classes that they put me in, I had already learned it. So that was an interesting experience. And then I started just, again, being observant and learning the ropes of the game. My mom always tells a story of like, she came to pick me up and I'm talking to a classmates and it's very Yankee, as we say, accent talking to them. And then I turn around and I see her and I'm right back into my Guyanese dialect. Is what take you so long for come and pick me up? And she's like, who is this child? Just so it's to me, it's incredible how quickly you learn to code switch when you're navigating a new world and environment as a child.
Very, I can relate to code switching. So that was my initial reaction, right? How we use or pick up or drop the accent depending on the environments. I feel like, I'm sorry, I'm going off topic for a second myself. I feel like we could do a whole series on just that part, right? But if I could just pick up one thing you said, that you, Michelle, and Isolina, you said this sort of as well before we move on to the next question, is sort of the educational opportunities, right? And Michelle, to even what you said, that's often I hear a lot of that with, since we're in an educational setting, right? Oftentimes students who enter, we may put them in remedial classes, but depending on the subject major, they may have already exceeded that in their home countries, right? We hear that a lot. For example, perhaps English is the language that they need to learn, but their math skills are above and beyond grade level, right? When coming to the US. So thank you for sharing that part. And I think we'll sort of explore that a little bit further in our conversation. So while we're talking about, coming to America, right? And it sounds like you both had a very similar experience where you literally thought that there was streets paved with gold, right? That's another common thing we hear of the experience of what America is like. Can you sort of dive a little bit more into that, right? And tell us, what was the experience like moving for you? What was it like to leave your home country and adjust to a new environment? If you could share a little bit more about that experience.
For me, it was very exciting because I was 7, and at the time, my dad had immigrated to the U.S. prior to and had to, get his citizenship and file for us to bring my mom and I up. So, we had been living apart. So finally getting to go was a big deal. There's a lot of like cliche stories of if, someone leaves a family at home, do they ever come back and get them? And it's sometimes they don't, and then that's the whole thing. But it was like, no, my dad did the right thing. He went ahead and paved the way to bring my mom and myself up. So getting to go was exciting because it was like the family was going to be reunited. We're going to be together after being apart and only seeing my dad like a couple of times a year after he had immigrated. And then just, getting adjusted to, being a family unit again. And then for me, almost instantly, my mom was pregnant with my sister. So I was like, oh, we just got back together and you're adding someone new into the mix. So that was a part of my adjustment story. And then, just getting used to going to school, the cold weather. Those are the kinds of things that still live with me and stay with me in terms of that.
Thank you.
So I think for me, developmentally, Michelle was 7 and I was 13. So there is nothing fun about moving at 13, unless you're, I don't know, going to Hawaii. But even then, right, it's that time of your life, peer group. And I think that my family, so my father passed away when I was 5. I never was raised with my mother. My grandmother was different. She was very different. And so, I think my mom was 18 and she told my dad, go get her. I was her first granddaughter. And so that's how the story goes. My dad went and got me, and that was the end of that. So I have to say, for me, growing up in Jamaica, I lived a good life up until 13. And so, even when they had to leave me, because you have to go through, like Michelle, go through the process of, residency and all the paperwork. I had to be adopted by a family member, one of my dad's sister, in order for me to come to the US. So my grandparents, they were, just at that age, they couldn't manage anymore. And all the younger cousins were together in one state, one parish. And so they left me with a nurse lady who had one daughter, and it was a great experience. I lived a good life. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. We, had our ethnic foods. Everything was what I knew. And so I come to the US and what the heck is this? First of all, what's going on in these schools? So my birthday's in November. And what happens is, because if you're a Burr baby, for those who know, I had another cousin who started high school. So technically I should have been in 8th grade, but I went right to high school. Big mistake. It was the worst experience of my entire life. I went to Bloomfield High School for 1 year, and I had never been accustomed to wearing regular clothes to school, because back home you wear uniform. I had like 2 brown uniform skirts and like 4 white shirts. But here, it's a big deal to go shopping at the end of the summer. What is that? And so, back in the late 80s, early 90s, you could get away with going to school in a different town without being caught. So we were living in Hartford, and my aunt worked it out where we would go to school, because we come from a strong educational background, in our family. And so for her, Bloomfield school system was a much better school system than Hartford. And, it started to get a little tricky. There was a lot of buzz around charging families who are, the deal, stealing seats in other towns. And so I had to transition to Weaver High School, another big mistake. It was great because there were more West Indian students in that school environment, but it was a Hollywood fashion show. And at 13, 14, we didn't fit in. It was the first time in my life I see my aunt bring home these big black garbage bags. And like, oh, what's that? It's used clothes, and not even used clothes from family members. It's from people we don't know. And so it was tough. And so for high school, I don't know, Michelle, if you had this experience, whatever you wear this week, you can't wear it next week because it's not cool. It's just not cool. You have to wear it a couple weeks out. And that's a lot of social pressures for a teen coming from a different country who doesn't understand the custom, who, doesn't have the resources to even try and keep up with, right? The Teen Joneses, I call them. So for me, it was different. However, one of the most impressionable experiences that sit with me, and I don't think many know this about me, but I am infatuated with cultures, and especially the Hispanic culture, because one of my first mentors, Millie Montalvo, she ran a teen group at the YWCA in Hartford. And I remember just being hooked on the language, because for those of you who speak Spanish or understand phonetically, it's very easy. It's much easier to follow, right? And I was hooked. And so I think for me, being a part of that group was important. So sooner, after a couple of years, maybe just before I graduated high school, they started to have the new students arrival program. And I guess they're there to, work with immigrant students who can connect with each other, because it's a very different environment. Not accustomed to students swearing at teachers, walking out the classroom. And so here I am in the middle of, okay, how am I gonna be who I am, preserve my identity, but all these new teen stuff coming out, right? Which, I tried a couple, but it didn't work for long. So for me, it had started to turn for the better, but high school was horrible. Now college, a new self emerged, and it was just a great experience. And again, I cannot emphasize enough the opportunity for education that really made a difference in America.
Thank you. Yeah. Michelle, would anything to add? Or
I mean, yeah, I was just thinking back to the different levels of navigating it. I know one thing, just a quick story in terms of clothes and stuff like that. Sneakers is one that always stood out for me. Like, my mom could not afford whatever the brand name Nikes and things like that were. So she got me, like, Payless was our shoe store, if anyone remembers Payless. But like, there's the one time she bought me these sneakers from Payless that looked like a knockoff of one of the brand name ones. I wore them one time to school, got totally picked on, bad ridicule, never again. She's like, why are you not wearing the shoes? I said, I'm not going back to school in those shoes. I'd rather wear flip-flops. I was like, you can't wear knockoffs, mommy. I'll get picked on all the time. So that's one thing that clothes and different levels of engagement, and what you were saying about how students were cursing at you, like, that stuff does not fly. Diana, we were still in the days of corporal punishment. So being disrespectful to teachers, corporal punishment in schools, like, you get popped on your hand with a ruler. So like, watching other kids do that, I was like, no. You did not want your parents to come up to the school at all.
Michelle, thank you for bringing that up about corporal punishment, because one thing that I appreciate about my American experience, I remember back home after lunch, there was a class exercise where you have to repeat your times table. So this is for grade school. And, part of the daily routine, and you have to literally, 2 times 2 is 4. You got to do it all. And sadly for me, the assistant principal was my math teacher for that segment. God bless her. Maybe not. And so I just remember she would walk around, just imagine her hands behind her back with the belt folded. And not only are you repeating your times table, but she's watching your lips. And I remember this, I think, in 5th grade. And so in Jamaica, we have systems, right? You have 5A, B, C, D, and E. So everybody know if you're an E, it's special education services to its max, right? And I remember her walking around and we're repeating our times table, and I was stumbling and I was stumbling. And there goes the bell, right? Pow, pow, pow. And what I learned from those experiences is how traumatic that can be for learning, and how it makes, it creates these barriers, right? These frontal lobe barriers to, oh my gosh, I can't think, I can't process. And there was, I would say, I don't want to say no respect, but little understanding for the diversity in the way people learn or view information. And so that to me was a hallmark part of coming to America and having that opportunity, because, that was removed. Everybody was on different levels, but the goal of making sure that all students were educated felt different here than it did back home.
That also reminds me of, it seems like education in many other countries, right? Not speaking for all, but a lot that I've heard of is more focused on memorization and repetition, right? Than necessarily like the learning process, right? It may be different from now, but I've heard many stories like the ones that you have just described, that you both described, right? And also another step in terms of education, another thing to the social norms, right? As you were saying, nobody cursed at a teacher or, did any of these behaviors, or it's a culture shock. Another thing is like the formalities, right? So, if you're in a college setting, you only refer to your professor as doctor. You have to come dressed up, even thinking about dress, right? I know individuals who have literally been asked to leave a classroom because they're not dressed appropriately, which means they don't have a shirt and tie on, right? I would already be inappropriate for a classroom right now in many European places. So, even when a student comes over here and, let's just say where we are, right? Sometimes we are informal, right? Students call me Lisa. It's doctor, it's supposed to be. So we've been thinking about these sorts of norms and these interactions that we have and how that could shape an individual's learning experiences.
Absolutely.
I did receive a question from Ken in our audience very quickly, so I'll ask the panelists since it's on our topic, and then I'll also add something after your comments. But Ken's question is, are the experiences of boys notably different in the experiences?
I think so. Boys, in my experience, by the time they are 12, 13, it feels as though there's a cultural push for them to go out and help, right? And so be it in the fields. I know things have definitely changed now with the 21st century technology, but farming and, I forgot what it's called, but you go out and you get the mangoes off the tree and you go on the side of the road and you start, you sell, right? Or you join your family members who sell in the market. And so there is a greater push for young boys to become men sooner than later. Another dynamic, I know you ask about boys, but another dynamic for girls is because of the limited opportunities for employment and even to pursue college, girls tend to kind of grow into their promiscuity and, start having children much younger than they obviously should, because there's such limited resources, teen programming. There is just none of that, right? I think now things are definitely different, but opportunity is a challenge on a small island. There isn't enough room for individuals over 30 and 40 to be in the job market to compete with, the 18 through 25-year-olds. It's just not available. So jobs that, a McDonald's job, for example, that would go to or should go to an 18 to 25-year-old is probably going to a 40 to 50 something year old person. So yes, there is definitely differences in terms of how boys and girls are treated, issues with pay, which I think is similar here, but yeah, definitely so. Michelle, I don't know.
Come from a family with a lot of women, so it's just like I don't know. I can't speak to much of what, but a lot of what you said did resonate in terms of. But I feel like that's true for all children in like Caribbean backgrounds, but definitely more so for the boys. To at a young age, you start having to be a contributing member of the family, being that you're pulling in resources to keep the family afloat. So I know that's definitely a thing, and I think for males that have immigrated to the U.S., the experiences are similar in terms of the engagement with the education system. There are other nuances that I'm sure that are probably more aligned to the Black male experience in the U.S., again, because by virtue of skin color, that history gets put upon us. So I would think the experiences are similar to that.
And I'll just add, I would agree that, there's a little bit more of a focus on going out into the workforce to work, to contribute to the family, to the household. So there may not be as much of a focus on education, or education is secondary to bringing in an additional income. As far as clothing, I've heard a little bit about clothing, but I think it's a little bit less, sort of, again, did I have the right brand? Am I wearing the right outfit? Am I sharing clothes with my siblings? Right. And, if I'm in the same high school as my siblings, did someone see my brother wear this and then I'm wearing that? And I feel like you both sort of mentioned this, but I feel like especially in the 90s and early 2000s, sneakers were a really big thing. That was a very big thing, and having the right sneaker. So I feel like I've heard that both for boys and girls. And I've also heard a lot for boys and girls in terms of, Iselina was saying, of like, what group in high school do I belong to? And even if they're not Polish or, similar to me, if they're an immigrant group, I can relate, right? So depending on where someone lands, right? Because someone may land in America where there's no community like them. We know that typically the trend is when a group arrives, they're going to where there are resources, but that's not always the case. But it's also finding who can relate to me, even if they're not from my home country. Right?
Shared experiences.
Yep, shared experiences. So Ken says, thank you both. Right? So moving on to our questions, right? Thinking about resources. When you moved, were there resources that were available to help? Were there resources available to support you in your transition and adapt?
I think for me, coming at such a young age, I wasn't necessarily privy to all of the nuances of having resources, but in reflecting back on it, we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, and it was me, my mom, and my dad. Then it was my sister, and then it was my grandmother, still in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. I think I remember that my mom had WIC after she had my sister, but other than that, I don't know what other community resources were available to them or that they tapped into. I know that both my parents worked 2 jobs. So I know traditionally there's a big culture of, when you're in the Caribbean culture, of not taking handouts and things like that. So there might have been a lot of pride where, like I said, both of my parents worked 2 jobs at one point or another in order to make all of the ends meet. But for me, I felt like we were resourced because I had clothes on my back, food in my belly, And, you know, I was going to school consistently, and then occasionally we did something fun. So at the time, my child brain don't know what other things my parents had to do, but that's what I remember.
I think for me, and I would agree with Michelle that, you know, being in my teenage years, I'm not thinking about resources. I'm thinking about how I look, because of back home, you know, I wasn't focused on how I look. And in America, you know, it's just like, oh, everything is on the TVs. This is how you're supposed to look. You know, don't eat too much. Don't wear this. And it was just so much. So I don't think I was as focused on what really helped me to adjust to the environment. But I do remember a few things. One, my aunt was very resourceful. And so she worked at Travelers at the time and was not afraid of asking for help. And I think that's a big part of it. And so, you know, the Hartford community had summer camps. And I just remember I was, you know, we got like a check for $100 just to show up and play, right? So that was pretty cool. So I felt special that I know I could shop and get some clothes. Um, Within the school, I think sports was a big thing for me. So, you know, using my teachers as a resource, joining the volleyball team, and just making sure that as an individual coming to this new environment, like you said, Lisa, what, you know, what are the groups that I feel most connected to? And those things helped tremendously. But for me, I mean, I was just going through the motion. And to this day, it was so traumatic that if they took all the schools off the planet and find another way to educate children, I'll be so happy. Because I think that when you're not in the building with them, be it a parent, a support, we truly don't understand all the dynamics of what goes on in school. You know, you have one group that's just doing what they do and they're socially equipped. And then you have another group that's trying to figure out, and then you have the isolated group. And there are inadequate resources to truly ensure that every single student in a school building feels connected, feels safe, and has the resources available to them. So can you tell I'm biased?
Yeah, you really have me thinking back to what that was like. And now that I'm thinking about it, I was the kid that was, I guess, isolated. I found one friend or two or three people that vibed with me, and then we did our own thing. Especially since for me, my parents were not keen on the whole no sleepovers and none of that stuff. So it didn't make sense to build these lavish friend groups. And if I wasn't readily accepted in it, I just, you know, either turned inward or I found at least one other person that vibed the way I did. And I think that's how I survived middle school. And then high school was freshman year was like that too, where it was like, it was a bigger school than I was used to. And it was a school that had kids from all 5 boroughs in the city. And so freshman year, I just found one or two other folks that were nerdy and weird like me. And we sat in our corner of the cafeteria. And then as time went on, you know, what was good about my high school is it had a variety of cultural clubs. So there was a Black Organization for Student Strength and West Indian Society Club. And that's where the Black and the Caribbean kids met once a week. And we talked about, you know, what our experiences were that. So that became the resource in high school, was then getting connected to the kids that were similar and had shared experiences. And then that's how you survived it together. So yeah.
When you said sleepover, I nodded my head very, you know, vehemently, because it made me think of, there were no sleepovers as well. And now that I think back, the only sleepovers I had were at my cousin's houses.
Right.
Because we all grew up together. We were all like within 5 years, you know, age of each other, right? The oldest and the youngest. It was only my cousin's houses. And usually it was because our parents were going to a dance anyways, right? And then the one friend that I could sleep over, like in middle school, was a Polish family and the mother was a teacher in the Polish school. So like there's this community connection, right?
Mhm.
Thinking about how groups, sort of come together, right? And how, what does that mean, right? How does that look? So I can relate to the no sleepover unless it was, a family member's house.
Mhm.
So I've just reflected really quickly that, oh my goodness, all of the parenting habits from my grandmother and grandfather have certainly passed on through my children, because as much as we had a neighbor back home, my grandmother did not believe in going to other people's house. We would play on the street in front of the house, but don't you even think about going to someone else's. And I don't know if that's specific to a West Indian culture. I think it's just, I'm sure there are families and communities here in the US who believe in those same principles. And even to this day, my oldest will say, I got a sleepover when I was like 14. And it was Miles, he doesn't count. But what I think about was, oh my goodness, it has certainly shaped how I instill in my children how to choose their peer groups. When my 13-year-old, brought this friend home and he pulls me aside and says, see, mommy, I choose friends that make good choices. And I go, oh my God, the precious. So a lot of that does carry over. But I'm in a much better place because I think moving out of high school, going to college was where the sunflower just bloomed. The identity came together. Learning how to navigate living with people from different environments. My professors, who I credit 100% to allowing me to say stupid stuff and never once telling me I was wrong or that didn't make sense. And only as I developed into my adulthood, I go, oh my gosh, they let me say that. And so for me, that was the time of my life where the American dream really started to make sense for me.
Wow. College was when the American facade came to my reality. I had like the total opposite. I feel like I became militarized and radicalized in college and was like, this country is oppressive to Black people on so many levels. And it was like, my college experience was like night and day and I thought I would be fine because Geneseo is a small school in a village in upstate New York. And I was like, oh, it's going to be the same like high school. It's kids of all different backgrounds and cultures and whatnot. It was not. It was not. And I learned a lot about myself and what it meant to be me in this skin in this country. So, yeah, a different flower bloomed.
Yeah,
might have been thorny.
You make a good point, Michelle, because one, I just reflected, our leader at my undergraduate institution, the president was an African-American male. And there was the sense of comfort, even though I think, the population of African-American students maybe was 12%, if that. But the comfort of knowing that when we faced certain issues, he was a resource because he could understand and he put on the agenda, right? Because there was that relatedness. And so maybe for me, that made a difference in terms of how we were able to address certain issues.
Oh yeah, I would definitely agree that made a different impact. The leadership reflecting like that. Yeah.
And thank you both for sharing. And I feel like we're going into our last question. So I might sort of go into that question now, because our last question is around identity, right? And I think you're touching, on that topic, so, to some, not to finish just yet, but, how does immigration, how does this shape your experience, right? How has coming to America shaped your life experiences and views of society in the world?
I think for me, it is a gift to have been born in a different country. And so what that has shaped my identity in that, you know, I love to travel. One of my places that I really didn't think I would travel to was Germany, and you can't get any whiter than that. And it was an amazing experience to have gone through not only my upbringing of being a Jamaican, but to have migrated to the US and to go to college and to be in this space with people that are truly from all walks of life.
Mm.
And to graduate and pursue and to travel and go to different countries and embrace some of what the experiences that I've had. It is this authentic, real, you know, just amazing part of who I am. For example, you know, part of my identity, I love talking to people about, you know, I don't know where you're from, but you look like you could be, right? And so I like just learning about the fabric of who we truly are and not being afraid to say, you know, for example, I have some kids on my friend's team, and I could tell that they have something other than just being Caucasian or Indian. So, and engaging people in that dialogue. So part of who I am is embracing the diversity of experiences that I've had, overcoming a lot of, you know, trauma in adjusting to this world that isn't nice, like Michelle says, to people, you know, to my people and to all kinds of people. And I've really liked that part of the process. I love languages. I act like I can speak a lot of different languages, but I really can't. But I am that person because I think it is true to what I believe God has positioned me here for, you know, and that is to just respect and appreciate people from all walks of life. And it's just amazing.
Thank you.
I would agree. As many trials and tribulations that you experience as an immigrant in the U.S., it's definitely shaped the person that I am today. I'm blessed to have, you know, have had my cultural upbringing and then keeping with me and finding ways to keep it with me, even as I assimilated or adapted to American culture and finding ways to infuse the two. And even, you know, the challenges that I had in my college experience, I still wouldn't change it for anything because it really did. That's when I came into, you know, being who I am today and kind of seeing, you know, to Isaline's point, now seeing myself more as a global citizen. If I hadn't come to America, I wouldn't have experienced or met as many different people from different backgrounds, had the opportunity to travel abroad and then, you know, even see the world in a whole different light, but still based on the experiences that I had in both of those locations. So it is a blessing. It does expand your worldview and what you think is possible.
Mm.
And so that in of itself is a gift.
Mm. The possibilities, right? Because you know, Lena, you mentioned this, and I hear this from my own community members, right? Many times, you know, coming to America is for opportunity, right? You know, we talked about this last time when John facilitated our historical overview, right? Many times people leave for different reasons, leave their home countries for different reasons: war and safety, so escaping; for opportunity, right? Or due to lack of resources, right? Those are sort of your three main areas, but usually under it all is opportunity in the United States, right? You know, I've often heard from my parents or friends of mine who are like, if we stayed in Poland, we wouldn't have anything of what we have here, right? And I think even in that process, it, to Michelle's point, it shaped her worldview of like, what's possible? What does it look like, right? But I know one of the things I'll sort of add is that I kind of sometimes struggle with is, what does being Polish American look like now? You know, am I less or more Polish than I was 10 years ago? I would argue I'm probably less Polish, right? There's many things that I don't do, right? Like I don't eat Polish cuisine all the time. I don't, I don't go to church as often. Yes, Uncle John, don't look at me like that, right? I see you staring at me, right? Are there certain things that, as you evolve in your identity that, we choose to keep or not, and how does that look, right? Just kind of going off of what you were saying and relating to that as well, I wish I need to speak more Polish. I feel that way too. Sorry, Selena.
No, I was just going to say, you bring up a really good point, because I think, it's a journey that we all struggle with, whether you are an immigrant or you were born on this soil, right?
Mhm.
Is if we're not careful, the identity we think we have is different from the identity we truly have. And it takes a fully conscious and aware person to recognize. It's kind of like you got to know when your body's starting to itch a little bit. Like, wait a minute, this doesn't feel right here, right? And so as we develop new parts of ourselves, is to really clear the lens and do whatever we can to be aware of the parts of us that's changing. So even for my American children, I would say to them, I said, listen, I wasn't born here. So if I'm going home, I don't care what the government say, you're coming with me too. So the responsibility, I would say, for American born citizens is to not take for granted that it is also your responsibility to stay connected to the history of this country, and recognizing that it was founded on people that came here. So if you are white, purple, green, or yellow, and you were born on this soil, that is not your heritage, right? It was brought by someone else in your family. And that's so important to share. And I really hold my students and my own children accountable for paying attention to that, right? And that's what makes it such a beautiful place to live.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I think back, in the last few years, or really throughout American history, where immigrants have been treated in certain ways, all these deportation laws and things like that. And I'm like, how could a country founded on immigration be this anti-immigrant? It doesn't make any sense. But it's important to say it, because I think because so much time has passed, they've gotten away from remembering and recognizing that that is at the foundation of American history, is immigration. It's
And the job market shows it, Michelle.
Right.
The job market shows it, we could pull all the studies that have been done. And there, as you all know, there are different classes of jobs and career. And this has not changed, at least in the 30-something years since I've been in America. And that is your most entry-level, disgusting, grimy, dirty, nasty jobs oftentimes are held by who? Immigrants. That has not changed in the 30-something years that I've been in America. So I think that says a lot in terms of, if people are willing to come to this country and work by any means necessary to get the opportunity, we should not isolate them. We should embrace them, because if they remove themselves, on the other side, there are natural born citizens who really don't have interest in working many of those jobs. So, a higher level of respect is what I hope for in terms of the immigrant community.
This was not even planned. You are completely setting up our next session in 2 weeks, because while it says social capital and immigrant communities, a lot of our conversation in the session in 2 weeks is network, but how do you, again, in fields of work, right? So to what you just said, Selena, how do we make connections and networks when you're new to this country, right? And to your point, I know many, many people who are high-level engineers back home, and they're working on the shop floor because of many different factors, right? Not knowing anybody, not having the English language. I mean, they could write the code that does this stuff, but they're the ones making the products, right? And we started our conversation about this, about education, and how sometimes we put students in remedial courses when, for example, yes, we have to teach them English, they have to learn English, but their math is 4 grades above where they are, right? That's something we see very commonly, right? So how are we helping meet their specific and unique needs, right? So so thank you for the tie-in, and that's my short little plug for the one for next in 2 weeks, right? But how are these networks connected, right? Because one of the areas of my interest is, why do we see in immigrant communities certain groups do certain jobs? So for example, I know a lot of individuals who, Polish men, work as engineers or in the factory, and women work in the medical field. And that has always been a research question of mine. Why? And we can go into other groups as well. Some of it's opportunity, some of it is knowledge, right? Knowledge of what, like in Poland, math and science is highly, recommended, right? So I don't really belong anywhere because I write and I'm a sociologist. Where did I come from? But so I'm going.
Did you also include, why is it that immigrants tend to have multiple jobs?
We see that as well, right? And we'll touch base on that, right? So sort of building up social and financial capital, right? While our conversation in 2 weeks will focus on social, meaning network, but thinking about the financial capital that needs to be built up, right? I've had plenty of conversations in Greek communities about families who have restaurants, but the children don't want the restaurants, right? And how do they build up a college level portfolio and going into a different field when they may not know somebody in that field, right? So that's where a lot of our conversation is going to be, but we see that sort of generation to generation as well. Any last thought, any questions from the audience? This has been a very quiet audience, so thank you. While we have a few more minutes, do we have any questions, any thoughts? You can feel free to ask or write in the chat. Oh, John Kanya, please.
One point that Iselina made that I saw so tangible was as an ESL teacher at Three Rivers Community College in Norwich, the majority of students who filled my classes were working housekeeping or those jobs, those on your feet for 8-hour jobs at the casinos, the nearby casinos, and all they wanted was enough English to move up, move forward. And they struggled to come to my class because, like Iselina's right, they were working 2 jobs. So they were just struggling. I was offered to teach an ESL course at Bunker Hill Community College in Boston, and it started at 11:30 at night because that's when the shifts were in between, and they were so overwhelmed with the waiting list that they actually considered doing an 11:30 at night class. And I'm thinking, how do I get the tea? How do I find parking? But it's interesting how there's such a dramatic need that sometimes isn't filled. And it comes down to, how do we move people? Because it's just language. It's nothing else. Just a little work on language. So thank you for those insights.
Thank you.
I leave this to say, one of my mantra is reminding myself that the sandbox is truly for everyone. Because there are these times where I want to play in that sandbox and I start, and it's like, did you just step on my this isn't for you, And so just a simple child metaphor, the sandbox truly is a space for everyone, and we're responsible to make sure that we keep that frame in the work that we do to create, right, that buzz and policy change to say, yeah, we need to do more.
Absolutely. Any other questions, thoughts, comments?
I think they're ready for lunch.
I know we stand between you and lunch usually. So in that, I want to thank our speakers, Iselina and Michelle. Thank you very much for sharing your stories, for sharing your experiences in our lecture, in our session today. I am very grateful. Thank you all for attending as well. Your support is greatly appreciated in this lecture series. As I had mentioned, our next one is going to be on June 30th at 12:30, and it is focused on social capital and immigrant communities. We will have a speaker from the University of New Haven at that time. So we'll follow a very similar format, but we're going to talk about networks and relationships and how this may shape immigrant communities. If you have any questions about the series or anything else, I'll stay behind for a few minutes, or if you'll please feel free to email me at lwishniewski@goodwin.edu. And again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to our speakers for their time today. And I wish you all a lovely afternoon.
My pleasure. It was fun.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
guys.
Thank you for having us.